Everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a two-game college football slate for you that starts at 7 p.m. Eastern. We feature two good games here, and Rice versus Tulsa, which is an American Conference matchup, and then we have a game between James Madison and Marshall, which is a Sun Belt game. These games should be a little bit better than the couple games that we had yesterday, so I do expect this to be a fun slate. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really does help the channel a lot. Let's go ahead and take a look at our bets our bets and stuff real quick. So we'll start with the Rice and Tulsa game. This has a -3.5 for Tulsa. I'm actually going to take Rice in this game. I think this is going to be a fairly even matchup. As we can see, they're both matching up pretty easily, and actually Rice is a slightly better team probably offensively. Now Tulsa does have a slightly better defense, but I don't think it's going to be enough to make a difference. Also, Tulsa does run the ball a lot, and Rice tends to throw the ball the most. And so I think Rice has a little bit of upside in this game from that perspective, but we'll have to obviously watch the game to see. I also think that the game's over-under is very tight, so I do think they're going to score in that range. I'm leaning barely to the under, but it's just not enough to make me want to take a bet on it, so that's what I have for that particular game. As for James Madison versus Marshall, I have James Madison -4. They're just mostly the better team by a long stretch. Both teams tend to run the ball and pass the ball pretty evenly, and they both have decent quarterbacks, so I think there's some viability for both teams here. Um, the I do think JMU wins though, even though Marshall does have the better running back. JMU has a much better defense this season. The over/under is pretty low at 49.5, so I do like the over a lot in this one. As we can see, uh, James Madison has covered it 4 out of 6 games, and they've also been decent in the over/under, and Marshall has too. So I think it's a viable option for this particular game here. As for the DraftKings side of it, let's go ahead and get into that here. So we'll start with our quarterbacks, and we really have 3 quarterbacks I like a lot, though there are 4 quarterbacks worth looking at. We'll have to go team to team here, though. So first for Rice, we're going to look at Daniels for Rice. He's got the most yards on the slate and most touchdowns, but he also leads in the interceptions as well. But he's second best quarterback rating, and he's the only quarterback really that doesn't run the ball a lot, so that is a concern here. But he definitely has some potential for a big game, and he is pretty fairly priced at $7,400. All 4 quarterbacks are within $1,000 of each other, so you're really going to just want to pick who you think is going to score the most fantasy points. Now, he's averaging 21 fantasy points a game, and as you can see, he's been good all except for that first game against Texas, so he has some really nice upside. He was the quarterback at West Virginia before, so I think he's got some nice potential in this one. Though he is riskier because he doesn't run the ball very much like the other 3 quarterbacks do. As for Tulsa, now this is where it gets kind of flanky. So Cardell Williams was a starting quarterback, but he relinquished the role to Brilliant Braxton. Now Braxton was the starting quarterback in Week 1, but he got hurt, and then he came in late in the FAU game to play and throw a touchdown pass. So I think he's got some capability. I looked at last season's stats, and he had 1,000 yards in the last 4 or 5 games, 10 touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Though his quarterback rating for the season is really low, he definitely has some capability. He also ran the ball 55 times for 5 touchdowns, and he also faces the weakest defense on the slate. So he does have some potential, but he's high risk, high reward. He seems like he's going to be a riskier, especially if we're not certain if which quarterback is going to start. It looks like Braxton is likely going to, though, and so I do like him there. But if Williams was to start, then I would definitely avoid Tulsa from the fantasy perspective, as he's been pretty bad with the exception of 1 or 2 games. So moving into our JMU Marshall game, so we'll start with JMU here. McLeod for JMU looks really good today. He doesn't have the most rushes of any of the quarterbacks, but he does have the most touchdowns outside of Daniels, as he's had 14 touchdowns and only 3 interceptions. He doesn't throw the ball as much as the other 2 teams do, but in Marshall and Rice, but he has had some success here. He's had 10 touchdowns the last 3 games that he's got on here, and we can see the fantasy output has been pretty solid. He's not as consistent as Daniels is, but he is definitely capable of a good game here. As for Marshall's quarterback in Fancher, he's run the ball more than any other quarterback on the slate with 73 rushes, 196 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Now, that rushing bonus does give him some upside, but he has been inconsistent throughout the year. But this matchup does give him some utility. However, he does need to throw for some touchdowns to really pay off here. But he is capable of that, and he's had some good games lately. Though he has the toughest defensive matchup on the slate, and so that is where the concern lies. So if I was going to rank the quarterbacks, I'm going to say McLeod, Daniels, Francher, and then Braxton. But we really kind of have to say unknown about Braxton. So that's what I have for running backs here. Moving into the running backs, so this gets really kind of strange with the way the pricing is here on DraftKings, but that can bode in your favor. I have three running backs that I've targeted. It was really good, and then we have a couple others that are backups and stuff like that. So we'll start with Rice's running backs here. Now they have two guys that are kind of in the timeshare, and that's Connors and Aventavio. Now Connors has more upside as he also gets a lot of receptions through the air in some games. As you can see, though, his fantasy output is kind of tied to that. Rice doesn't throw the ball a ton, but they don't run the ball a ton, but they're the only team that primarily passes. But he does get a lot of passes through the air, and even though he only has 41 and 180 yards on the ground, he's got 24 catches for 306 yards and two touchdowns in the air, and that's really very useful, especially at his price point at $4,800. He seems very good for that. He's also got a pretty decent defense from that perspective. Excuse me, as well. Sorry about that, guys. Then we'll look at Atavanio for Rice. Now, he doesn't get as many carries as Connors does, but he still has some potential. He's had a couple good games this season, though he is high risk, high reward. He is a very Hail Mary contrarian option, especially for a team that doesn't run the ball very much. Moving to Tulsa, Watkins is really the only guy to consider here. Now, he's had a lot of a lot of touches, second on the slate, but his yards have really left a lot to be desired, and he's got a tough matchup here defensively. He hasn't been particularly great touchdown wise either. He's only had two, and as you can see, he's only had two games where he's got over 10 fantasy points. So while he is in play, he has a high risk factor on this particular slate. And one of the reasons I like Rice is because Tulsa really doesn't is pretty limited from the running back position, especially considering the fact that they run the ball more than any other team on this slate. So they will look at JMU here. And Black for Madison isn't a timeshare, but he is the lead back. He's similar to Connors, and he also gets passes through the air, which gives him some upside here. As you can see, he's been in over 10 fantasy points in all but one game, and he has some nice upside as a result. He's also nice and cheap at $5,000, very similar price to Connors, who's $4,800. Lawton is the timeshare guy that competes with him, but he's had one good game on the year, so he does have some potential, and he's had a couple of touchdowns, but he's high risk, high reward. But he does get enough touches to be considerable, and he's about the same price as Avatavio, so he has some capability. He also has more touchdowns on the season, but he is high risk, high reward. And then moving to Marshall, they really only have one running back that gets a lot of touches, and that is Ali for them. And he's absolutely a monster in touches. He's at 124 on the season. He's at 641 yards and 11 touchdowns to the ground. He has 15 receptions and 144 yards to the air. He gets the most of both of those for his team, and he also is number one in yards and total rushes on the slate. So he looks like he's got some viability, though he has the toughest matchup from a defensive perspective outside of Tulsa. But as you can see, he's been able to dominate teams all season long with several multi-hundred-yard games and a couple multi-touchdown games. I do look for him to get a touchdown in this game one way or the other. He's only had one game where he didn't, and that was against NC State. So I do look for him to do well here, though they are at risk of getting behind early, so that is a concern here. But he is capable, even when they've been behind against Georgia State, they got blown out, and he still managed three touchdowns overall. So I think he's a great option on the slate, though he's also the most expensive running back on this one. Moving into the wide receivers here, excuse me. We're going to start with Rice's wide receivers. Now, they have the deepest wide receiving core here as uh, outside of as that they throw the ball the most. Now, Marshall throws the ball the second most, but I do think Rice has got the best upside from the wide receiving ranks. McCaffrey starts that. He's been really solid with 30 catches, 514 yards, and 6 touchdowns. I look for him to continue that. He's had some really good games. He has the most upside of any wide receiver on this one, and he's nearly a must play. Obviously, he's also one of the most expensive options, but you're going to be able to afford them. Nobody's too terribly expensive on the slate, so it's helpful. Now, McNeil for them is also in play. He's really stepped it up the last 3 weeks and looks like he's become the number 2 guy for their team. So, and he's nice and underpriced at $4,600. I don't expect him to stay that too much longer. So, I expect him to be highly used today, as he does seem to be the favorable target. Now, Walker was the number 2 guy, but he's really kind of fallen off. He's had some big games this year, and he is capable of a good game, but he has been inconsistent. So, while he does have 13 touches and 200 yards and 2 touchdowns, he is capable here, but he's high risk, high reward. And then Groen, he is the tight end for them, and he's been increasing his total catches last few weeks, and that gives him some utility here, especially against a weak defense. But I do think that he's high risk on this one, but he's dirt cheap, so he's a way to kind of pay up for other options. Moving to Tulsa here, Shoulders is likely to miss this game, so obviously he was their top running back, or sorry, wide receiver. So Devon Williams becomes the top guy, and he's had some good games this year, though he's been somewhat inconsistent. His price has popped up as a result of the injury to Shoulders, and so that gets. But I am a little concerned about this team's offense, as Camden Benjamin has also been pretty good the last few weeks, but he hasn't hit over 10 fantasy points yet this year. So he is capable. He is increasing his touches, especially if Shoulders is out. But he is high risk, high reward. Don't like much about Tulsa today, to be honest. Looking at JMU, um, we have 4 wide receivers that have some utility here. Brown is the top option with 423 yards and 2 touchdowns. Now his catches have been inconsistent. He's really just had a couple big games. He's averaging about 8 fantasy points a game without the massive game he had against Utah State. But he is capable of a big game. He's just high risk, high reward on this one. Surratt is a little bit of a safer option, as he's been getting more catches recently, and his good games are a little bit more consistent. He's had 3 games over 18 fantasy points. He's definitely a capable option on this one. Horton is a tight end for them, and he definitely has some utility here as a tougher matchup, and that should give him some opportunity to have some catches, though he has been inconsistent this season as well. He's averaging 7.8 fantasy points a game, but that's all because of the 130 fantasy point game he had where he had over 100 yards. And then Sprawls for JMU, also very cheap here. He has some boomer bust potential. He's had a couple of good games, but he goes a lot of games without any catches at all, so do keep that in mind. Looking at Marshall here, they have some injury concerns, but I do think McMillan misses and Coombs is a top play. He has 23 catches and 2 touchdowns. The yards for this team are very inconsistent because it seems like a lot of different guys are getting looks throughout these games, but nobody's getting more than a couple catches per game. But Cooley is the tight end here. He is in play, though he's been inconsistent. If he is playing today, then he'll have an opportunity to have over 10 or 15 fantasy points. But he is high risk, high reward. And then Simmons is probably the safest wide receiver when it comes to this team, as he's been really improving the last couple of weeks, though he still is inconsistent, as he really didn't do much throughout the first part of the season. He's had two straight weeks where he was the top wide receiver outside of the running back Ali, so I think he's got some capability in this one, and he's nice and cheap, so that's an advantage here. But with that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.